Normandy, late summer 1944 dawn lifts over wet hedgerows, and a rail siding turned into a rear area cage. Canvas tents bead with mist. Barbed wire runs in new angles across an orchard. On a line of M1937 field ranges, bacon snaps in shallow grease. Coffee breathes from battered urns. A bakery truck cools racks of white loaves under tarps. Military police lean from a timber tower, rifles slung, faces unreadable. Along a segregated strip of wire, a small group of German women wait. Helferinnen from signals and flak units. Red Cross nurses with armbands stained by travel. Skirts dusty. Hair pinned under field caps. Identity slips clipped to tunics from intake. Their eyes track the mess line. The smell reaches them first, salt, fat, and smoke, moving across damp grass with the steam. They were told to expect hard faces and thin rations. Instead, a clerk ticks names on a roster. A medic gestures toward the wash basin and the infirmary tent. The ladle rises and falls in measured strokes. It is a quiet, procedural morning, and it contradicts weeks of rumor with the ordinary comfort of breakfast. To understand how this scene could exist, we have to see the war, the law, and the supply chain that brought these women to this fence. By the late summer of 1944, the Western Front was producing prisoners at a rate the U.S. Army had planned for, but rarely seen in earlier campaigns. Among the columns of men were small, distinct groups of women: Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe auxiliaries, communications specialists, anti-aircraft support staff, and Red Cross nurses pulled from collapsing ports, overrun command posts, and field hospitals left behind during the Allied advance. They were not civilians in the simple sense. They wore uniforms, carried papers, and in some cases had been assigned pistols for local defense. In U.S. custody, they fell under the same legal framework that governed captured soldiers, the 1929 Geneva Convention. The pattern of capture was tied to geography. During the Normandy breakout, U.S. forces took Cherbourg's garrison, late June 1944, and then fought toward Brittany's ports. Brest fell in September after a costly siege. Lorient and Saint-Nazaire remained isolated pockets under blockade until the war's end. Signal sites, flak positions, and hospital detachments inside these areas included female personnel. The Nachrichtenhelferinnen and Flakhelferinnen who manned telephones, plotted aircraft, typed orders, and kept the machinery of war running. As transshipment nodes and headquarters fell, these women were collected along with other personnel and marched to rear enclosures under military police guard. The law set the tone. U.S. doctrine, expressed in the War Department's Rules of Land Warfare, FM 27-10, 1940, and theater directives, treated women serving with the armed forces as prisoners of war entitled to the Convention's protections. That meant segregation by sex and rank, humane treatment, adequate rations, medical care, and protection from public curiosity or retaliation. It also meant forms, numbers, and routine. At the point of capture, MPs disarmed and searched. Identity slips and field papers were logged. Temporary tags were issued. In larger enclosures, a provost marshal's office created a roster that matched names, dates of birth, and service with a camp number for tracking transfers and mail. The European Theater of Operations had already built a spine for this work. Under Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, CHEF, and U.S. Theater Command, ATUSA, Suder tu hada tu fiwa forof, the communications zone administered prisoner of war temporary enclosures, PWTEs, strung behind the railheads and depots that fed the front. These were not permanent prisons. They were processing fields, barbed wire, guard towers, a small headquarters, a dispensary, and a mess capable of feeding thousands in rotation. As the Allied advance pushed east from Normandy, the grid shifted. Enclosures opened near Cherbourg, Rennes, and Le Mans. Later, behind Aachen and across the Rhineland. When the Ruhr Pocket collapsed in March and April 1945, mass surrenders flooded the system and forced expansion on a scale not seen in France. Within that structure, women were a minority. Most German prisoners were male combatants captured in units or in scattered groups trying to reach the Rhine. Female auxiliaries and nurses appeared in smaller numbers, often in intact clusters pulled from specific installations. The U.S. response reflected both policy and improvisation. Theater orders directed segregation and the use of female personnel, where available, for searches and supervision. In practice, military police enforced strict protocols to prevent misconduct when female staff were not immediately on hand. The imperative was plain: keep order, keep records, maintain standards. Expectations met this order at the wire. German propaganda and rumor during 1944 had painted a harsh picture of Allied custody. The women who reached U.S. enclosures had lived through air raids, shortages, and often a hurried retreat. Many expected rough handling. What they found instead was a sequence: disarmament, delosing, medical check, registration, and a place in a mess line that ran with the same discipline as any U.S. units. The difference was sensory before it was intellectual. Field ranges burned gasoline, coffee came from large tins, bread cooled on racks from a traveling bakery detachment. When bacon appeared, issued under B ration breakfast menus when supply allowed, its smell traveled farther than any order of the day. The rations question was not a matter of charity. Under the Geneva Convention, the detaining power was obliged to provide food equal in quality to that of base troops. In the European theater, that standard meant bread, meat, vegetables, and coffee as a baseline in rear areas. At the front, the B ration, canned and dehydrated components cooked by a mess team, dominated. Behind the front, A rations, fresh when available, could enrich menus. Bacon was a standard issue item in U.S. breakfasts when stock permitted. Powdered eggs and cereals filled gaps. For prisoners, portion sizes were set by tables, not moods. Quartermaster officers counted calories, not anecdotes. Medical officers wrote the parallel story in pen and numbers. At intake, every prisoner passed a quick triage. Obvious injuries and illnesses were diverted to dispensaries or hospitals. Malnutrition and fatigue showed up in posture and on scales. For women coming out of encircled ports or hastily evacuated hospitals, the first days could be a reversal. Calories up, pulse steadier, sleep deeper. In many enclosures, a separate sick ward or tent row handled female patients, supervised by medical staff with orders to maintain privacy and decorum. The aim was not comfort in the civilian sense. It was stability, documentation, and throughput without avoidable harm. Security and intelligence were never far from the mess line. Female communications personnel and flak auxiliaries had seen the interior of command nets, duty rosters, and air defense routines. Interrogation teams, some with German-speaking WACs or civilian linguists, more often with male officers and NCOs trained for the task, worked within the law, building timelines and patterns rather than extracting secrets by force. The routine helped. A prisoner who knew when she would eat and where she would sleep was easier to question and more likely to answer coherently than someone kept in fear. Inspectors general circulated through rear compounds to audit procedures. International Committee of the Red Cross delegates gained access more readily in France and the interior of Germany than near an active front. Their reports tracked kitchens, infirmaries, and mail, and they noted when women were housed and guarded separately as the rules required. None of this erased the war's violence. The enclosures stood in landscapes of burned villages, cratered crossroads, and trains loaded with wounded heading west. The women in line had been part of a system that sent shells skyward and messages along wires to guns. Yet inside the fence, the U.S. Army made the case that custody could be orderly. The bacon on the range, the coffee in the urn, the bread on the racks. These were not symbols chosen for effect. They were the inevitable products of an army that fed itself well and extended the same standard to those it captured, because the law demanded it, and because discipline required it. The scene that opened this story, steam lifting over a rail-side cage, a segregated wire, a measured ladle, only makes full sense against the apparatus that supported it. Policy set the floor. The next layer was supply, the mechanics that turned obligations into breakfast. Behind the wire, routine depended on a system built long before dawn touched that Normandy siding. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force set policy. The U.S. European Theater of Operations executed it through the communications zone and a ladder of provost marshals. Their tool was the prisoner of war temporary enclosure, the PWTE, a functional grid of wire, towers, tents or huts where possible, a dispensary, a records desk, and, crucially, a mess that could run to a schedule. These sites rose along rail spurs and near depots from Cherbourg and Rennes to Le Mans, then east behind Aachen and, later still, across the Rhineland. The temporary in their name mattered. PWTEs were designed for intake, sorting, and onward movement. Enlisted ranks flowed one way, officers another. National categories split again. Women, Helferinnen, and nurses were separated from the start, held in small compounds with screened latrines, designated wash lines, and supervised access to the dispensary. Guard duty remained with military police. Processing, interpretation, and medical care pulled in specialists, including German-speaking personnel and U.S. Army nurses in rear hospitals. Where Allied female staff were unavailable at the wire, commanders enforced strict search protocols to preserve decorum and legality until transfers placed women in more suitable facilities. Food anchored everything. The Quartermaster Corps fed the threat and the remedy. Huge columns of Allied troops pushing east, and, behind them, prisoners by the tens of thousands. The B ration, canned and dehydrated components prepared by a field kitchen, was the staple in enclosures closest to the front. Its breakfast menus, when supply allowed, included bacon, cereals, powdered milk and eggs, and the ever-present coffee from 32 to 2-pound tins. Farther back, in rear areas that qualified for A rations, fresh meat and produce supplemented the same baseline. Bakery companies, the mobile detachments with M1937 field ovens, turned out racks of loaves that cooled under tarps and moved by the crate to mess lines. The effect inside the fence was sensory as much as nutritional. Hot fat, yeast, and coffee steam said more about American capacity than any bulletin could. Records kept the promise real. Geneva's text required that food for POWs be equal in quality to that of base troops. In practice, theater ration tables set minimums by calories and variety. Quartermaster officers logged issues per head. Medical officers charted weight and noted edema receding with protein in the diet. Inspector General teams visited rear enclosures to audit kitchens, sanitation, and discipline. International Committee of the Red Cross delegates gained access more consistently in France and interior Germany than at forward cages, noting where women were housed separately, how often they could bathe, whether mail moved, and what the mess served. The system flexed under pressure. Normandy's summer and the autumn fighting around Aachen stressed the grid, but did not break it. The Ruhr Pocket did. In March and April 1945, Army Group B's collapse produced mass surrenders that overwhelmed newly created Rhineland enclosures stretched along the river meadows. Conditions there were austere in the first weeks, shelter scarce, ground wet, kitchens improvising under sheer numbers. Even then, provost orders prioritized the rapid transfer of female prisoners to smaller rear compounds or to Allied partners capable of providing segregated accommodation. The goal was the same one written in every directive since the landings: keep custody legal, verifiable, and controlled. Transfers followed policy and politics. The United States moved large bodies of German POWs to Britain, France, and, later, to labor programs under Allied supervision. Women were a fraction of total headcounts and were often repatriated faster once security screening, medical checks, and documentation were complete. Red Cross nurses, clearly marked and verifiable, were processed with an eye to quick return when higher authorities approved. Helferinnen attached to flak, or signals units, followed the standard POW path longer, though still with segregation and the same ration standards. In all cases, paperwork, names, dates of birth, units, medical status controlled the pace. Across this landscape, the mess remained the one feature any prisoner could predict by sound. Field ranges roared at first light. Bread arrived in stacks. Coffee moved in tin mugs along trestle tables. Bacon, when it appeared, was portioned by the book. It was not every morning and not at every enclosure, but where it was, the smell cut through fatigue and fear and left a particular memory, one tied to the way the U.S. Army ran itself and, by law, chose to run its enemies in custody. The scene of women behind a segregated wire watching a breakfast line, then stepping into it by roster and number, sits at the junction of policy, logistics, and human expectation. To see it clearly, we can turn the lens to the people who stood there, the tactical and intelligence uses of order, the machinery that made bacon and bread appear, and the leadership and moral choices that set the limits of what could happen at a fence. Angle 1, human hunger, shows first in posture, shoulders forward, eyes on the tray, not the guard. In the women's compound, the sequence repeats by roster number: wash, triage, registration, mess. A medic notes temperature and pulse. A clerk checks identity slips against a typed list. Then the sensory pivot arrives: steam from galvanized urns, yeast from cooling loaves, a shallow pan where bacon snaps in its own fat. The smell overtakes the wire before the women reach the table. It is ordinary to Americans. It is unexpected to those who have come out of air raids, ration queues, and a retreat that offered little more than ersatz coffee. Portions are measured, not improvised. A ladle of porridge or potatoes, a slice or two of bread, bacon when issued under the breakfast schedule, coffee poured to the same line in every tin mug. The discipline matters. It ends the surge that begins when fear and scarcity meet a table. Medical staff watch for dizziness, for the first signs of refeeding trouble in those who arrive thin and exhausted. In rear areas, a separate tent row handles female patients. Privacy screens rigged from canvas so that care is routine, not spectacle. Behavior changes within hours. Faces lift, hands steady on utensils. Questions shift from "what now" to "when mail" and "where work." The routine makes space for rules to be explained and followed. No one needs to be convinced by argument when a known meal arrives again the next morning. That is the human core of the scene at the wire. Bodily certainty replacing rumor. It is also the foundation for everything that follows, from questioning to transfers, because order that can be tasted is order that can be trusted enough to listen. Angle 2. Tactical and intelligence information rides on calm. In the European theater, Division and Corps G2 sections employed interrogation of prisoners of war teams, IPW teams, to screen and question at cages and rear enclosures. Female auxiliaries and nurses came with a particular map in their heads. Switchboard layouts, call procedures, shift rosters in signals huts, the rhythm of anti-aircraft alerts, the time it took to man guns after a siren, the location of aid stations and dressing posts around a flak belt. None of this required coercion to be useful. It required coherence. Coherence tended to arrive with calories and sleep. U.S. interrogation manuals emphasized tone, legality, and persistence over threat. The law set bright lines: no violence, no public humiliation, Adherence to the Convention's protections. The practice recognized a simple truth. A prisoner who knows when she will eat and where she will lie down is easier to ask the same question twice. IPW summaries and G2 periodic reports in late 1944 and early 1945 show how small, consistent disclosures, call signs, telephone exchange codes, morning manning charts, logistics shortages at a battery accumulated into patterns that planning staffs could use. The presence of separate compounds for women and clear rules for access reduced incidents and kept the flow of questioning steady. Even a breakfast detail could be a reconnaissance of routine. If a prisoner recognized a ration label, a bakery truck stencil, or a guard unit's patch, those details fed back into Allied assessments of supply and unit dispositions. But the larger effect ran the other way. A functioning mess line signaled to prisoners that promises were being kept. That impression mattered when interrogators asked for memory, not secrets. It also depended on machinery few people noticed, unless it failed. Angle 3. Logistics and technology. The mess line is engineered. Behind a fence in Normandy or the Rhineland sits an assembly of wartime technology tuned for repetition. M1937 field ranges run hot on gasoline. 10-gallon urns keep coffee near a boil. Mobile bakery companies, with portable ovens and dough mixers, work through the night so that racks of loaves can cool at first light. Refrigerated trucks stretch the reach of fresh meat and dairy in rear areas. Nearer the front, the B ration dominates. Canned bacon, dehydrated cereals, powdered milk and eggs, syrup, and jam. Quartermaster tables translate nutrition into issue. Ounces per head, per meal, per day. Cooks follow standardized menus so that a breakfast in Brittany looks much like one outside Aachen when supply allows. Women's compounds receive from the same pipeline, with distribution adjusted for headcount and timing. The segregation that law requires does not mean inferior provision. It means a second trestle table, a second urn, a second set of hands counting portions under watch. Medical officers log weight at intake and after 10 days. Inspectors general sample menus against the ration scale, where the International Committee of the Red Cross can enter. More often in France and interior Germany than at forward cages, delegates note calories, variety, and whether women can wash as often as schedules claim. Bacon sits in this system as both food and signal. It appears when stock and cold chain make it easy, disappears when trains and priorities shift, then returns without fanfare. Its smell travels far, crossing wire and expectation, carrying the sense that an army fed to a standard extends that standard to its prisoners by default, not by exception. The ability to do that rests on orders, audits, and command emphasis, choices that set the limits for what can and cannot happen at the wire. Angle 4. Leadership and policy standards began at headquarters and were enforced on trestle tables. Schaff and the U.S. European Theater issued clear guidance. Women captured in uniformed service, Helferinnen, nurses, clerks attached to the armed Siho. Forces were to be treated as POWs under the 1929 Geneva Convention. The theater provost marshal disseminated procedures covering segregation, searches, housing, and access to medical care. Where female U.S. personnel were not available at first contact, command emphasized strict, observed protocols by military police to maintain decorum and legality until transfer. The same orders that governed rations for male prisoners applied to women. Issue from the standard scale, document quantities, keep messes on schedule. Oversight sustained the message. Inspector General teams circulated through rear enclosures to audit kitchens and sanitation, check rosters against head counts, and review guard conduct. Reports moved up chains of command, prompting corrections when kitchens lagged or facilities fell short. In many rear areas, International Committee of the Red Cross delegates gained entry, a fact that concentrated minds. an external notebook. Measuring calories and conditions sharpened compliance more effectively than slogans. Theater medical officers published standing instructions for intake triage and isolation when needed, with attention to privacy in women's wards. Discipline had a legal edge. Allegations of abuse triggered inquiries, and courts-martial followed when evidence supported charges. The point, repeated in directives, was not image, it was control. Order at the fence began with predictable food, clear rules, and visible consequences for breaches. The bacon on a field range was not goodwill, it was the edible portion of a command climate that tied power to procedure and documented the link, day after day, under signatures. Angle 5, Enemy Culture and Cognitive Dissonance Expectation, arrived at the wire carrying Germany's late-war reality. By 1944-1945, ration cuts and shortages had reshaped daily life. Ersatz coffee stood in for beans. Fats were scarce. Meat allocations shrank. The women who reached U.S. custody came from signals huts, flak belts, and hospitals that had lived on scarcity while sirens and bomb blasts defined the clock. Propaganda warned of Allied cruelty. Rumor magnified it. Few had experienced American food in any form beyond hearsay. The first morning in a U.S. enclosure challenged that frame in mundane steps. Disarm, register, wash, line up. The senses recalibrated before the mind allowed it. Coffee with sugar. Bread with a fresh crust. A ration of bacon, when issued, snapping. On steel and carrying salt and smoke that made the whole enclosure smell like a kitchen, not a cage. Medical triage took pulses that slowed as calories rose. Sleep that had been broken by sirens returned in longer stretches under guard lights and watchtowers. The fear of blows gave way to the anxiety of rules, curfews, rosters, work details that held and repeated. None of this erased allegiance or shame. Many spoke little. Some refused to answer beyond name and unit. Others measured each word against a future they could not see. But the sensory shock, American foodways arriving with clockwork, planted a new reference point. The enemy's power expressed itself as process, not rage. A plate that matched the posted ration table did not make friends. It made memory. In later testimonies and interviews, that memory often surfaced first as a smell. Bread cooling, coffee rising, bacon crisping. The detail endured because it stood at the junction where indoctrination met routine and found itself outnumbered. Angle 6. Moral and comparative terrain. No theater escaped hard edges. In spring 1945, mass surrenders in the Rhineland produced improvised enclosures on open ground that struggled to meet shelter and sanitation needs during the first weeks. Conditions were austere until logistics caught up. The record includes shortages, sickness, and uneven performance, debated since in scholarship and memory. Within that strain, theater orders continued to prioritize the transfer of female prisoners to rear sites capable of segregation and proper facilities. Inspections and external scrutiny by the ICRC in rear areas and by Allied staffs pushed corrections. The standard was the Convention's language, measured in rations, medical logs, and rosters, not in aspirations. Comparisons cut in multiple directions. German treatment of Allied POWs ranged from correct compliance to grave violations. Allied custody ranged from exemplary to flawed under pressure. The U.S. Army's claim in the European theater rested on systems that could be audited. Ration, scales, bakery outputs, inspection reports, disciplinary actions. It also existed beside contradictions on the American side, most notably the wartime internment of Japanese-American citizens at home, a domestic policy with its own ledger of harm. Those truths sit together. they do not cancel the requirement, under arms, to keep custody lawful. For female German POWs in U.S. hands, the moral calculation became visible at breakfast. A measured portion of bread and meat issued on time was the smallest proof that rules were binding. It did not absolve anyone of service in a regime that had waged aggressive war. It did not promise comfort beyond the minimum the law demanded. It did demonstrate that the detaining power would be judged by more than victory, that it would attach its reputation to routine, down to the bacon that appeared or vanished with. Supply and returned without drama when trains and trucks aligned. These angles, command emphasis, cultural shock, and ethical limits come into sharp relief when tested against specific captures and enclosures, where paperwork and mess lines must hold under names, dates, and numbers. Normandy's first test of the U.S. prisoner system came at Cherbourg. Between 26 and 29 June 1944, General J. Lawton Collins's 7th Corps broke the port's inner defenses and forced capitulation of the garrison. The collapse yielded columns of prisoners funneled through hastily prepared enclosures, strung along rail spurs and roads south of the docks. Among the ranks of gray tunics were small groups of women, signals auxiliaries from telephone exchanges, flak plotters evacuated from command posts, and Red Cross nurses pulled from overrun wards. Military police took charge with a practiced sequence: disarm, search, register. A provost desk on trestles recorded names and units. A medical tent triaged those with wounds or fever. Segregation was immediate. A narrow run of wire, latrines screened with canvas, and a guarded path to the dispensary set off a compound for women within the larger cage. The mess told the prisoners what the rules were. Field ranges rattled on gasoline. A bakery detachment pushed racks of loaves from a truck and let them cool under tarps. Coffee came up in dented urns, bitterness softening when sugar reached the ladle. Under the B-ration breakfast schedule, bacon appeared when supply allowed. When it did, its smell carried beyond the wire and cut through fatigue in a way orders never could. The portion was measured, slices counted against a head tally, mugs filled to a line. There was no theater to it. It was a schedule, kept. From Cherbourg, the advance pivoted toward Brittany. Brest, declared a fortress, held out until 19th of September 1944 under General der Fallschirmtruppe Hermann Bernhard Ramke. U.S. 8th Corps, under Major General Troy H. Middleton, the 2nd, 8th, and 29th Infantry Divisions foremost, ground block by block through a city of rubble and reinforced cellars. As German lines contracted, female personnel once dispersed across administrative and air defense sites were pulled inward. DRK nurses still on duty in cellars, communications auxiliaries in bunkers carrying clipped messages to surviving switchboards, flak support staff near batteries that could still lift their barrels. When surrender orders came, military police and infantry guides moved quickly to separate officers, enlisted ranks, and women for escorted marches out of the fortress. Processing repeated the Normandy pattern at larger scale. Temporary cages rose first near the outer road net, landerneau and road junctions east of the city, then staged transfers to established PW enclosures deeper in the rear, including sites near Rennes and Le Mans, where the communications zone already had a spine in place. The women's compounds remained small, but their routines matched the book. Female search where available, strict observation by MPs when not, a designated wash line, and escorted movement to the sick ward. Interrogation teams, German-speaking officers and enlisted intelligence specialists, worked at tables under canvas, drawing out switchboard codes, battery rosters, and the rhythm of alerts in the Brest flak belt. Coherence improved with calories and sleep. The connection was noted in G2 summaries as a practical fact, not a theory. In both Cherbourg and Brest, the ration grid did the quiet work of making policy visible. Quartermaster officers issued from theater tables that equated prisoner food with base troop standards in rear areas. B rations were the staple near the front, canned components combined by cooks into breakfasts that could be portioned quickly and repeated without guesswork. A rations enriched menus when rail and port flow permitted fresh issue. Mobile bakery companies stayed in motion, their ovens producing hundreds of loaves nightly, so that mess lines would not falter at daylight. In this setting, bacon's appearance was intermittent, dependent on stock and cold chain, but never arbitrary. It arrived when the ledger said it should, vanished when stores thinned, and returned on the next train as if it had never been in question. The human pivot remained sensory. Women who had lived for months on reduced rations and ersatz substitutes halted at the first waft of hot fat and coffee. The surprise was not abundance in the civilian sense. Enclosures were austere and controls were constant. The surprise was regularity. The bread that tore easily, the sugar in a mug, the salt in a measured slice. These details contradicted rumor and made the rules legible. Medical officers measured the result in weight and pulse. The first 10 days in custody often saw a steadying curve, edema receding, dizziness reduced, sleep returning in longer stretches, especially for those who had arrived straight from bombardment and retreat. Oversight framed the same statistics in ink. Inspector General officers circulated through the rear enclosures to audit kitchens and sanitation, to compare head counts with rosters, and to note whether segregation and privacy were being observed in women's wards. In France, especially as the front moved east, International Committee of the Red Cross delegates gained access to PW enclosures more consistently than in combat zones. Their notebooks recorded what the mess served, how often inmates could bathe, what mail moved, and whether women were housed separately as required. The presence of an external witness concentrated attention at every level, from the mess sergeant counting slices to the provost signing the inspection report. Not every cage met the ideal. Rains turned fields to mud. Transport schedules slipped. At Brest, in the days immediately after capitulation, the sheer number of prisoners taxed shelter and latrine plans until transfers cleared the bottleneck. Yet inside the limits of what could be built with timber, wire, and trucks, the system kept its center: predictable rations and orderly custody. For women, that meant fewer abrupt moves, faster transfer to smaller rear compounds, and medical attention in wards where privacy screens and separate rows lowered the temperature of a process that might otherwise run hot with rumor and resentment. The few operational payoff showed up in the tempo of questioning and in the absence of disorder. Intelligence teams wrote that routine produced better answers. Military police reported fewer disturbances when messes hit their marks. Provost summaries tied both to the same cause. Clear rules held, and those rules were made credible at the table. The bacon on a frying surface, mundane to the cook, became a sensory proof that this custody was run by schedule and law. The point did not require speeches. It required the next meal to match the last one. By the time U.S. forces crossed into Germany and surrounded Army Group B in the Ruhr, the apparatus built in Normandy and tested in Brittany faced a far greater strain. Mass capitulation would push the prisoner system hard and force austere improvisations beside the river meadows, even as commanders tried to preserve the same guarantees for the smaller number of women in the tide of captives. Across the Rhine, the numbers became landscape. In late March 1945, Allied crossings, Operation Plunder on the Lower Rhine, and the expansion of bridgeheads elsewhere were followed by encirclement. By 1st of April, Army Group B under Field Marshal Walter Model was trapped in the Ruhr. U.S. 1st and 9th Armies tightened the ring from east and west, while British forces pressed north. In this pocket, units surrendered by battalion and regiment, then by the thousands without formal formations, columns of men walking west with hands high. Among them were clusters of women, signals auxiliaries detached from headquarters, anti-aircraft support staff pulled from battery perimeters, Red Cross nurses who had remained at dressing stations until orders dissolved into gestures. The U.S. response required speed and structure. Along the Rhine's western bank, a chain of open-ground enclosures, Rhine meadow camps, was built in days. Wire and guard towers went up in river meadows and fields near rail lines. These sites were austere by design and by necessity. Minimal shelter at first, latrines cut fast, water points established, field kitchens arriving behind military police. Registration desks under canvas took names and units. Screenings for officers, NCOs, and enlisted ranks began as quickly as pencil and paper allowed. Within that tide, women were identified and moved into segregated pens inside or adjacent to the larger cages. Where numbers were small, commanders pushed for immediate transfer to rear compounds. The directive repeated in orders was consistent. Separate female prisoners, enforce decorum, and move them back along the rail as soon as transport allowed. At the Rhine Meadows sites, the mess line defined what could be promised. In the first weeks, the strain showed. Kitchens worked through B rations in volume. Stews, porridges, bread when bakery trucks could reach the wire, coffee in urns that never seemed to hold enough. Bacon was rare in the meadows at first. Trains and trucks fed the encirclement and the crossing armies before they fed camps that had appeared almost overnight. The issue tables still governed quantity, but variety took time to recover. Inspectors general circulated as the sites stabilized, noting shortfalls and pushing corrections. As trains and weather improved, bakery companies brought routine with them. Field ranges multiplied. Loaves cooled under tarps. Coffee met the line in full mugs. The baseline returned. Transfers did the rest. Female prisoners were moved out of the river meadows as soon as headcounts and transport made it possible. North and west into rear zones where established PW enclosures had separate compounds and staffed infirmaries. In these sites, near Koblenz, Andernach, and across the interior of France, conditions resembled the book more closely. Segregation by sex and rank was normal rather than improvised. Wash times and medical checks kept their slots. Interrogation teams worked in tents rather than at field tables, taking down the routines of signals nets that had collapsed days before and the locations of flak sites that now stood silent. Where the International Committee of the Red Cross could gain entry, more common as the front moved east and the pocket emptied, delegates recorded that women were housed apart, that rations matched scales, and that mail began to move. Breakfast became a barometer. In the meadows, early on, it meant porridge, bread when it arrived, and coffee stretched to meet head counts. In rear compounds, a week or two later, it meant a return to schedule. Bread every morning from bakery racks, coffee at full strength, bacon on days when stock permitted. The smell carried its own report. A system shaken by numbers had found its pace again. It was not abundance in the civilian sense. It was consistency. For women who had lived months under shortages, alarms, and rumors about Allied custody, that regularity was the point. It framed every other interaction, registration, questioning, transfer orders, with a cue that the rules being explained would be kept. By mid-April, mass capitulation had emptied the Ruhr's fight. On 17th April, U.S. forces reported hundreds of thousands of prisoners processed across multiple army groups. Model dissolved what remained of Army Group B. Within days, the pockets of organized resistance were gone. The river meadows slimmed from crisis to routine. Rear compounds absorbed transfers, including the small cohorts of female auxiliaries and nurses who had been caught in the surrender. The war in the West was in its last weeks, yet the machinery of custody, wire, rosters, kitchens, was at full run, orienting from the battlefield to the longer work of sorting, healing, and sending people home. The days that followed made the rhythm permanent. Breakfast lines at rear enclosures wrote the same answer each morning: a measured plate, a filled mug, a standard kept. From that rhythm flowed interrogations that aimed at doctrine and industry rather than tomorrow's artillery target. and transfer plans that would refill trains bound for established depots in France and the interior of Germany. The scene returned to what it had been in Normandy, only larger, law and logistics binding the anger of a war into procedure. Victory in the West turned the prisoner grid from a battlefield tool into an administrative machine. After 8th of May 1945, U.S. provost offices shifted from intake under fire to classification, medical screening, and movement under scheduled rail. The columns did not stop. They slowed and spread. In that stream, female German personnel remained a fraction. Signals auxiliaries, flak support staff, and Red Cross nurses, gathered in small cohorts and kept separate by wire and roster. The priorities were written into orders: segregate, screen, treat, transfer. Theater provost marshals directed that women be held in designated compounds or blocks within larger enclosures, with guarded access to wash points and infirmaries. Medical officers repeated intake routines now familiar to every camp: temperature, pulse, weight, a quick look for infection or injury, isolation when necessary. In rear areas, U.S. Army hospitals maintained women's wards under clear privacy rules. The goal was not comfort. It was documentation and stability, so that movement orders could be issued without avoidable harm. Oversight deepened once the guns fell silent. International Committee of the Red Cross delegates, already present in many rear areas, gained more consistent access to camps across France and the U.S. occupation zone in Germany. Their notebooks tracked the same measures that had framed wartime audits: calories per head, sanitation, separation of women, male frequency, medical access. Inspector General teams continued internal reviews. Where kitchens lagged or facilities fell short, corrections followed on paper and at the trestle table. The equilibrium depended on fuel, flour, and discipline. It also depended on speed. In directives and liaison meetings, commanders pressed to move female POWs out of temporary sites and into established rear compounds, or onward to repatriation at the first opportunity. Transfers ran on agreements as well as rail. The United States shifted large male POW contingents to Allied partners for labor and custody. Women were handled differently. Red Cross nurses, clearly identified and verifiable, were often processed for early return when higher authority approved and transport opened. Helferinnen attached to flak or communications units moved through standard POW channels for a time: interrogation, screening, and classification, then appeared on repatriation lists earlier than male cohorts once security questions were resolved. In practice, that meant weeks to a few months in U.S.-run rear enclosures rather than seasons. The pattern shows up in provost summaries and ICRC correspondence. Small numbers, segregated holdings, accelerated movement when trains and authorization aligned. Labor rules held in the interim. Under the 1929 Geneva Convention, eligible prisoners could be assigned non-military work, paid at set rates credited to camp accounts. For female POWs, assignments remained limited and local: camp maintenance, laundry, kitchen assistance under supervision, rather than the heavy labor that absorbed male POW manpower across Europe. Pay was recorded. Purchases, where canteens operated, were regulated. The model was the same one applied to male prisoners in rear areas, scaled to small headcounts and tighter controls. Health charts told their own steady story. Intake weights recorded after capture rose in neat increments over the first 10 days for those who had arrived thin and exhausted. Edema eased where protein returned. Infirmary notes tied improvements to diet as much as dressings. The items were ordinary: bread from field bakeries, hot stews built from B ration tins, coffee poured from 10-gallon urns, powdered milk in hospital cups. Bacon, when issued under breakfast menus in rear camps, appeared without ceremony and left a trace that outlasted the meal. A smell carried into memory. Years later, that detail surfaced quickly in letters and interviews. Not abundance, but the regularity of a plate that matched a posted schedule and a posted scale. Legal categories shifted on paper in 1945 as the Allies restructured custody and responsibilities, but the practical measures at the fence remained familiar. Ration scales tied to base troop standards in rear areas. Medical care logged by name and date. Segregation enforced by roster and guard. Where the ICRC could inspect, reports listed separate compounds for women and noted when repatriation lists began to move. Where conditions fell short, especially in early, crowded phases in the Rhineland, IG memoranda and theater orders pushed transfers and improvements, with women moved earliest to rear facilities capable of meeting the rules. Repatriation ran from staging points under U.S. control to handovers at zonal boundaries and railheads deeper in Germany. Liaison with emerging German health and relief offices under Allied supervision accelerated the return of nurses to civilian hospitals in the shattered cities. Helferinnen cleared through screening posts joined the broader stream of POW releases. Most were home by the end of 1945 or early 1946, with exceptions held longer as witnesses or for additional review. The paper trail, rosters, medical cards, transport manifests fixes the tempo better than any memory can. It shows a system intent on clearing its books without losing the standards that had defined its claim. What endured for many of the women was smaller than a document. It was the sensation of a routine returning to the body amid defeat. Bread that tore easily, coffee that arrived hot, a measured slice of meat on mornings when stock permitted. That feeling framed the recollections that would surface decades later, and it sets the stage for the broader echoes of this experience in peacetime habits and policy conclusions. Peace thinned the lines but thickened the ledger. With hostilities over, the U.S. prisoner system became a record-keeping enterprise that fed three outcomes: transfer, repatriation, and historical proof of standards kept. For the small cohorts of female German POWs, Helferinnen from Signals and Flak, Red Cross nurses, the horizon was usually close. Security screening, medical clearance, and transport orders moved faster than for the large male work detachments parceled to Allied partners. Many women were home by late 1945 or early 1946. Their time behind U.S. wire measured in weeks or months rather than seasons, return did not erase context. Germany's rationing remained severe. The Hungerjahre followed, with shortages digging into daily life despite Allied relief and the first care parcels in 1946. Against that backdrop, the memory of U.S. camp food stood out not because it was lavish, but because it was regular. Bread every morning, coffee strong and sweet enough to notice. On some days, a measured portion of bacon that announced itself by smell before it reached a plate. In post-war interviews, that detail surfaced quickly, tethered to the first morning when custody felt like order rather than danger. The administrative trail confirmed what memory preserved. Provost summaries, Inspector General audits, and International Committee of the Red Cross reports from 1945 to 1946 described separate compounds for women. Rations issued on the same scale as base troops in rear areas, medical charts that recorded weight gain after capture, and transfer lists that cleared female prisoners comparatively quickly once screening was complete. Where early improvised sites in the Rhineland had strained under mass surrender, the record shows corrective orders, redistribution to rear enclosures, and an emphasis on moving women into facilities that could meet segregation and medical requirements. These actions were not simply humanitarian gestures. They fed into Allied policy on stabilization and legitimacy. The United States could point to verifiable compliance with the 1929 Geneva Convention, rations, sanitation, medical care. At the same time, the occupation authorities were compelling denazification, rebuilding institutions, and confronting displaced persons and devastation on an enormous scale. For prisoners, the procedural steadiness mattered most. It made questioning coherent and transfers orderly. For commanders, it insulated camps from unrest and provided a defensible administrative record in a Europe that would soon divide along new lines. Lessons were captured while the wires still stood. The Provost Marshal General's wartime experience in Europe was distilled into after-action reviews and training material for guard forces and camp staffs. The conclusions were plain. Predictable food and medical care stabilized custody. Segregation and privacy for women reduced incidents. Inspection and external observation improved compliance. And intelligence benefited more from routine than from pressure. These notes moved forward into post-war doctrine and would reappear refined in the way later conflicts handled prisoners and the way appeals to surrender were crafted. There were private echoes, too. Some former auxiliaries and nurses went before denazification boards, Spruchkammern, to classify their service. Others stepped quietly back into family roles under ration cards and coal shortages. Few spoke publicly about captivity in the immediate years after war. When they did decades later, the recollections rarely sought grandeur. They centered on particulars: a roster called at daybreak, a paper cup in a dispensary, the smell of bacon crossing wire on a cool morning, while a clerk checked a name against a typed list. Those images remained because they were proof that rules could reach the most basic human need and hold steady there. Across the occupation landscape, American foodways threaded into daily life in ways that bypassed memory and entered habit. Bread from relief, wheat, coffee as a morning scent, canned meat and sweets crossing from bases, and aid into markets both legal and black. The camp breakfast belonged to that larger current, not as its cause, but as a vivid edge. It represented discipline made edible, law translated into grams and ounces, and the practice of power as procedure rather than spectacle. By 1946, the small female compounds had largely emptied. Files closed. Trains rolled on new schedules. The U.S. Army turned its attention to garrison tasks, repatriation of the last hard cases, and the early tensions of the Cold War. Yet the sensory imprint left by those mornings lingered. The way a measured plate could quiet rumor. The way a smell could contradict a year of fear faster than an argument ever could. That is the hinge where policy meets humanity. Small, repeatable, and stronger than it looks in a ledger. From that hinge, the story returns to its opening scene and widens into a question about what such moments mean beyond the fence, and what they still say about power constrained by rules when the shooting stops. The story circles back to a wet morning in Normandy. Wire in an orchard, a timber tower, field ranges rattling in the mist, bacon snapping on steel, coffee steaming in battered urns. A line moves by roster, not by force. The smell reaches the women before the ladle does. What happened there was plain. Power submitted to rules and wrote the submission in food, time, and paper. The Geneva text lived in tin mugs and measured slices. Quartermaster tables turned ethics into ounces. Inspectors checked the arithmetic. The International Committee of the Red Cross opened notebooks and watched. Discipline did the rest. It made the schedule repeat: a plate is not absolution. It does not change who fought for whom or what those uniforms signified. It does something smaller and harder. It sets a boundary and holds it under pressure. It says the detaining power will be judged by what it can count and what it can prove. Calories, temperatures, names, dates. The ordinary becomes the test. That test shaped more than one morning. It steadied interrogations. It reduced fear at the fence. It made transfers efficient rather than frantic. Later, it migrated into doctrine and training. Promise humane custody. Keep the promise. Expect order to follow. In the Cold War manuals and in later conflicts, the same linkage reappears because the logic does not age. Routine, delivered, outperforms threat. Memory keeps the scale honest. For many of the women, the war's end came with shortages, coal dust, and ration cards at home. Against that, the U.S. camp breakfast endures in a detail that fits in the palm. Bread that tore easily. Coffee that bit and then warmed. Bacon when stock allowed. traveling across a fence on a cold breath and contradicting a season of rumor. The camera holds on the trestle table, a posted schedule tacked to a pole, a roster clipped under a thumb, steam lifting into gray light. The ladle rises and falls in the same arc as yesterday and tomorrow. That is the measure offered here. Victory recorded not only in miles or prisoners, but in standards kept when keeping them was work. The wind shifts. The smell crosses the wire again. A name is checked on a card. A plate is set down. The world does not turn friendly. It becomes legible and, for a moment, survivable.